Hello YouTube friends, Gail's here with another writing workshop. It's been a while since I posted my first workshop, so I figured it was high time I made my second. Later in my example, the date will reveal I actually wrote this workshop a couple months ago, so I've been putting off finishing it for quite some time. Today's topic is centered around the words, telling, and showing. Once again, I'll be including a speed paint just so there's something to look at on the screen, but if you find it too distracting, you can close your eyes or look away. On the other hand, if you're here for the speed paint alone, then feel free to mute the audio and put on your favorite music instead. The characters in this video are Lanza and Orana, which are two of my D&D characters that are also the main characters of the story I use in my example. Alright, let's get to it. If you're a writer, you probably heard of the terms showing and telling before, but you may have wondered exactly what do they mean? Why are they so important in storytelling, and how can you use them to improve your writing? In today's writing workshop, I'd like to discuss the differences between showing and telling, what each of them has to offer to a story, as well as some things to keep in mind or avoid when you're doing one or the other. A common misconception I see is the phrase show, don't tell being tossed around, implying that showing is always a better choice than telling, which is a statement I strongly disagree with. I think both are equally important in aspects of storytelling, so to say one is preferred over the other can be very misleading. Non-fictional writing such as research papers, book reports, textbooks, persuasive essays, and other factual-based writing will be generally more telling than showing. However, even in creative writing, telling still plays an important role in a story's narration. Instead of telling someone show, don't tell, I think it's better to stress the importance of when and why it's better to choose one over the other, as well as how one can use both to support and complement one another, while providing examples of how a writer can accomplish this. Maintaining a balance between showing and telling is a daunting challenge that even experienced writers often struggle with. However, when you're able to clearly identify one or the other and know when to use them, your narration and storytelling skills are going to vastly improve. So get ready to put on those creative thinking caps as we analyze the differences between these two useful story crafting techniques. Since I mostly write visual novels these days as a bonus, I'll provide some specific advice directed towards visual novel writers. And of course, at the end of the video, we'll be workshopping ways you can practice finding the differences between telling and showing in your own writing, so that you can determine whether or not there's an imbalance between them. Telling is essentially factual, explanatory information that the narrator or another character provides without offering any concrete details. A general rule of thumb is, if it doesn't appeal to any of the five senses, then narrating is telling, not showing. For example, my name is Sarah. I'm a solo visual novel developer who lives in an apartment with my fiance. We have an 11-year-old son. One of my favorite hobbies is reading books. A fun fact about myself is that I'm completely obsessed with dragons. Telling is a story's narrative exposition. It contains information on the setting, characters, backstories, lore, or past events. Good telling is plain, simple, objective, straightforward, clear, and to the point. It's a quick way of giving information that's essential, but doesn't stress a whole lot of importance in the main focus of the story. It can help clarify factual information to the reader. It also appeals more to short-term memory than long-term. For example, if information is important for the current scene, but not so much later ones, then it's better to tell it than show it in order to keep the story moving along without delaying or overloading a reader with an abundance of details. Subjective opinions of a character, as well as abstract concepts such as feeling, emotion, and thought are also examples of telling. Some dialogue that is meant to be explanatory may also be considered a form of telling. Whereas showing is the descriptive, concrete details, it is the heart and soul of any creative writing. Showing allows us to set scenes, establish mood or tones within a story, and allows the reader to share in the character's experiences. It is more immersive and memorable as it deals in what the story is focusing on in the present. If the information is relating to one of the five senses, sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, then the information is being shown. Action and dialogue that is demonstrating a character's personality or mannerisms may also be considered as showing. Let's take the example from above and use showing to convey the same information, but through appealing to the senses as opposed to being direct. The white door squeaked open as Sarah walked into her apartment, keys jingling as she tossed them onto her wooden desk. Her fiancé welcomed her home with a grin, laying a kiss upon the softness of her cheek, his black beard scratching against the side of her face. Hundreds of colorful Legos lay scattered over the living room floor. She tiptoed across them with a mother's experienced caution. With a sigh, Sarah sank onto the couch, leaning back against a pillow. She opened a worn book, flipping to her reserved page. Her brown eyes began dancing back and forth as she became absorbed in her reading, getting lost in a world of fire-breathing dragons. This example suggests the same information as the previous telling example, but adds a little more than just the bare essential facts. It slows down the story's pacing, allowing the reader to immerse themselves into Sarah's perspective. Rather than directly presenting the factual information, it is demonstrating those facts, allowing the reader to read between the lines and determine that information for themselves. Additionally, it also establishes a cozy tone of someone coming home and getting ready to relax by reading and indulging in a little escapism. When comparing the two examples side by side as standalone paragraphs, it becomes clear that the showing example is more detailed and creative than the telling example, which is generally what people mean when they use the phrase show, don't tell. However, when you're looking at a story as a whole, there should still be a mix of telling and showing, or exposition and scenery, if you want to look at it that way. So now that we know the differences between telling and showing, when and why is it better to use one or the other? Telling and showing serve many useful purposes. They can help alter the pacing of a story, convey a sense of tone or emotion, provide new information to a reader, as well as stress the relevancy of that information. Whenever we get to a point in a story that we want to emphasize the importance of long term, such as introducing a new background setting or main character, or maybe an action scene that is going to have a huge emotional impact on the protagonist, this is where you want to slow the story down, filling it with concrete details so that the reader will become more invested and immersed into the story. They can share the same sights, smells, sounds, taste, and touch that the characters are sensing, sharing in their experience. In our above examples, let's say Sarah is the main character of the story, and we want to present a sample of what her daily life looks like. Then demonstrating her way of life through vivid details is a good way to go about it. However, what if Sarah wasn't the main character? What if she's just some random side character that's only going to be present for a single scene in the entire story? In which case, we don't really need to know all these details about her life. Maybe the only thing we need to know about Sarah is her name, and she lives in an apartment with her son and fiancé for the sake of clarity. So instead, we can use telling to present this information to the reader, either through narration or dialogue, and move on to more important matters. In this way, you're able to provide facts that might be useful for the reader to know for this one scene. But it's okay if they forget it in the next chapter because Sarah has served her role in the story, so it's okay if the reader forgets about her entirely. How to determine when to slow a story down with details or speed it up with straightforward facts can be quite a daunting challenge. It essentially boils down to, what do you consider to be the main focus of the story? What information do you want to emphasize to the reader? And what is better to just summarize for the sake of clarity so the plot can keep moving forward? You can also use telling and showing to reinforce one another. For example, telling a reader a character's name in order to differentiate one character from the other, then proceeding to show what the character looks and acts like in order to reinforce the character behind the name. Or vice versa, perhaps a character is acting calm and aloof on the outside, but on the inside they're nervous and insecure. The contrast between showing them acting calm and the telling that they're hiding the fact that they're nervous are working together to present a cohesive picture of the character as a whole. While balancing telling and showing is something every writer has to determine for themselves, I can at least offer some advice on how to better implement these techniques as well as some potential pitfalls to avoid while using them. These are common pitfalls I find in stories as a result of too much or too little showing and telling. Infodumping is a result of too much telling and too little showing. Whenever a story contains entire paragraphs or even pages full of nothing but spoon-feeding information to the reader, either in the form of narration or a character's monologue, perhaps explaining events that happened in the past, for example. This is what we call infodumping. Instead of dropping a whole bunch of information on a reader all at once, it's better to determine what information is essential for where the story is at in the present and save the rest for another scene as that information becomes more relevant to the story. Otherwise, the plot will be set on pause in the meantime, making the pacing seem slow and the story convoluted with unnecessary details. A story within a story is also an example of too much telling and too little showing. If a character or narrator is telling a story to another character or reader, it can make for a very stale reading experience, as the reader is essentially getting all the information secondhand after the events within the story have already taken place, instead of getting to experience it alongside the characters. Therefore, this is best to be avoided if possible, or at the very least summarized in a few sentences, as opposed to full pages or standalone chapters. Pick the story you want to tell, and don't lose focus. If the story within the story is really one worth telling, it'd be more effective as its own standalone spinoff or prequel, as opposed to distracting from the current story. Lacking clarity is a result of too little telling and too much showing. On the reverse side, if a story has too much showing and not enough telling, it may become difficult to follow due to a lack of clarity, in which the characters will know things the reader does not. Things like relationship status between two characters, what a character is thinking or feeling, what is their motivation for acting the way they do. Not establishing names of people or places to help the reader differentiate one from the other, failing to mention or explain an important past event that's having an effect on the present. Just because exposition can be easily overdone does not mean it shouldn't be present at all. A reader should be on the same page as the characters to avoid confusion. The readers may not care so much for the descriptive details if they're having trouble wrapping their head around the bigger picture. Withholding information can be a result of either too little telling or too little showing. It just depends. Sometimes a writer will be tempted to leave out essential pieces of information, such as a character's name or certain aspects of a character, for the sake of creating a sense of mystery. However, this can be very tricky to execute well. More often than not, it will be confusing for the reader and pretty obvious that information is intentionally being withheld from them, which makes it feel more forced or fourth wall breaking, as opposed to creating that sense of mystery that the author intends. In most cases, it's more effective to keep the facts clear, honest, and straightforward, telling the story as it is and revealing information so that it's revealed to the characters and readers at the same time, so that the reader can share in the characters' experiences, rather than being kept in the dark. There are a couple exceptions to this rule, one being if there is an unreliable narrator, but that's a little more advanced concept and not entirely relevant for today's workshop. Another exception is when the main characters are also left in the dark, because the reader is sharing in the character's experience of the unknown. Generally speaking, intentionally withholding information is best to be avoided. Instead, it's better to use descriptive, concrete adjectives to create the sense of mystery of the character or setting by establishing tone and mood of the story, not by concealing the facts. So now we're going to talk about how we can use telling and showing to affect the pacing of a story. If the story feels like it's moving too fast or too slow, take a look at the amount of telling versus showing, which I'll show a way to do this later in today's workshop. Chances are it's doing more of one or the other, rather than a balanced mix of the two. Maybe the story has too much telling and is full of nothing but info dumps without any immersive scenes to appeal to the five senses, letting the reader share in the character's experiences. Or maybe the story has a lot of action in it, which is a form of showing, but the problem is it's not descriptive enough and the passages are too short and choppy. On the other hand, it could feel as though it's moving too slow and isn't actually going anywhere. It could be the story is being overloaded with details and lacking in action, or maybe the story is lacking focus, in which case some of the less important scenes, such as getting ready for work in the morning or driving to a friend's house, may be better off being summarized with exposition instead of acting them out in detail. The important thing is to keep in mind, what is this particular part of the story trying to accomplish? What is its role in the story as a whole? By knowing the answer to these questions, you can then ensure the narrative has a balanced mix of telling and showing. All right, and then this is a bonus for visual novel writers, but if you're not interested in writing visual novels at all, then feel free to skip ahead to the workshop. When writing a story, it's important to keep in mind the media the story is intended for. A visual novel story should not be written the same way as a comic that generally has more visual aspects but no audio, or a movie script that has tons of visuals and special effects, or a video game script that might involve more gameplay elements, or a novel that doesn't typically have any images or audio to accompany it at all. Since I mostly write stories for visual novels, I'd like to share some insight on my personal experiences in terms of maintaining a balance between showing and telling. While the concepts of showing and telling are going to play important roles in a visual novel, they are slightly different compared to a novel without the visuals, especially in terms of the showing. The images shown on screen are going to fulfill the role of doing much of the showing that one would expect to find in a regular novel. Specifically in terms of physical traits, the way people and places look, or sometimes sound if the VN contains sound effects. There's no need to show what the background and characters look like in the narration, because the visuals are already doing that. Instead, the showing is going to be mostly done through the characters talking and interacting with one another, as well as perhaps actions that aren't apparent in the visuals. This is why a visual novel will often have more dialogue than narration, because the narration isn't as important as the characters interacting with one another. When I think of how to describe writing a visual novel script, I think it most closely resembles writing the script for a play, where the visuals serve as the backdrops and the actors, doing much of the storytelling for us. This is why I personally really enjoy writing for visual novels, because I can use my art to express the physical aspects while getting to focus more on the characters interacting with one another through my writing. I get to focus on showing complex interaction dynamics, personalities, and relationships. So if you're a writer who prefers storytelling that focuses on the characters, dialogue, and interactions, then maybe writing a visual novel is the perfect medium for you. For today's writing workshop, pick a short story or chapter to break down and analyze. We'll be using 2 colors of highlighter, this can work either digitally or physically, in order to highlight all the parts of the narrative you consider to be showing in one color, and all the parts you believe to be telling in another color. Doing this will not only help you consider the differences between the two, but when you're finished, you can look at the story as a whole and see if there's too much of one or the other, or a more balanced, even mix. If you find yourself highlighting entire pages all in one color, then consider if it may be leaning towards one of the pitfalls mentioned earlier in the video. Think of ways you could accommodate a more balanced mix of the two, either by adding more exposition or more depictions of scenery into the story. While doing this exercise, also determine what exactly is the story's main focus. What is the reason you had for writing it the way you did? Are you introducing characters, writing a romance, going for a story that's more action-driven, or one that's more psychological in nature? Consider how the telling and showing ratios are helping to support this goal, or how they could be implemented to better achieve the main focus or purpose of the story as a whole. To serve as an example, I've done this exercise with a chapter of one of my own stories, in which I'll break it down, explaining why I feel some parts are telling and others are showing, as well as reflecting on how they work together to support and complement one another. Alright, so the story I chose for my example it's one that I did a few months ago for a writing challenge where I set for myself, where I pretty much wrote a story a day. So I wrote this story in one day, so it's not exactly my most polished, bits of work, but I do think it's a good example because it's short and it does reflect my writing. I don't do a whole lot of story writing these days. I mostly do VN writing, but it's easier to do this with a chapter story. So, I highlighted in yellow what I consider to be telling. It is informative, relatively short, and straight to the point. It's intended to clarify certain things about the plot or characters, but it does not stress importance. Concrete things such as emotions, feelings, anything subjective or explanatory are examples of telling. The reason why it says it doesn't stress importance is because you'll see that the telling and the showing kind of play off of each other and they support one another. So we tell things, and then later we'll support it by showing it, you know. They kind of hint at one another. And it's when you combine them together, that's what makes a good story. And then green is what I consider to be showing. It tends to be longer, more detailed and descriptive than the explanatory passages. They are concrete and they appeal to one of the five senses: sight, sound, taste, smell, or touch. Actions are considered to be showing. Most dialogue also qualifies as showing, unless the dialogue is there for being explanatory, such as instructions, lectures, or storytelling, which are all examples of telling, even if it's dialogue. As opposed to demonstrating a character's quirks, preferences, or mannerisms, which are all forms of showing. So if a character is talking at another character and not with them, that is considered telling and not showing, and it is something you definitely want to avoid. You do not want to have a whole monologue where only one character is doing all the talking and explaining stuff. It's not fun to read. Trust me, it's not an interesting read. It's not a good thing to have. So I'm just going to go through it real quick. I am going to go break it down a little bit, at least part of it. I'm not going to break it down the whole thing because that will take too long, and it'll probably be boring. But just to go through it real quick, you can already tell that I have a good mix. This is pretty typical of my writing. I always go back and forth between explaining and showing. And yeah, this is what I consider to be well-balanced writing. You don't want to have full pages of one color or the other when you're doing this run through, because that's definitely going to be red flags. It's definitely something you want to break up. If you have too much showing, it's going to be a little artsy-fartsy, a little confusing, and not very clear. But on the other hand, if you have all telling, it's not going to be an interesting read. It's going to be very flat and one-dimensional, and it's not going to appeal to the senses. It's not immersive reading or writing, however you want to, whatever your perspective is on it. So definitely too much of one or the other is something you want to avoid. You want a good mix. You want a good balance. You want them to support one another and go back and forth. Okay, so we'll break it down a little bit and I'll explain why my reasoning of what is showing versus telling. So we start off with telling. Captain Sanguine's ship of wandering wonders, more commonly known as Serendipity, switched to showing. On the outside appeared to be just your regular galleon consisting of 3 large masts adorned with white sails and a banner depicting a red dragon fluttering in the ocean breeze. Though primarily a cargo ship, Serendipity's crew also accepted the occasional passenger, especially if said passengers happened to be the daughters of a chief investor, as was the case of Lanza and her twin sister Arana. So we start off with telling. We tell you the name of the ship. It's important information, but it's not really necessity. A name doesn't tell a reader anything. So if all you have is a name, that's not enough. You have to support that name with something showing what it looks like, what it acts like. Something that the reader can get a better picture of what this name symbolizes in their head. Name is not enough. So we reaffirm the name with some showing of what the ship looks like. It's a ship, it's a galleon. It has 3 large masts with white sails and a banner depicting a red dragon fluttering in the ocean breeze. It's just something to get the reader in their head of what we're talking about. Okay. And then we go back to telling a little bit about the ship, the crew, and we introduce the names of our characters. But once again, names are not enough. We have to confirm this back this up and support it with some showing. So, being fraternal twins, more telling, we're telling them that they're fraternal twins. Lanza and Arana were as different from one another as night and day. So we're telling them they're different. But then we back that up by confirming what's different about them. And we do that with showing. So Lanza supported shining knightly armor covered with a velvety maroon cape whipping heroically behind her. Her shortly cropped golden blonde hair gave her a tomboyish look. Strapped to her back was a 2-handed lance along with a shield depicting the emblem of the Rakshai Empire's royal family. Contrastingly, Arana's hair was long, lavender, wavy, the epitome of feminine beauty. She dressed in an elegant gown that mimicked the night sky, and a staff that's lunar tip gave off a faint, otherworldly glow in the approaching dusk of night. The most noticeable difference of all, however, was that Arana had 2 curving horns jutting out from the top of her head, emphasizing her draconic lineage, whereas Lanza looked like an ordinary human teenager. This specifically is more telling. This sometimes my mouse doesn't work right. The epitome of feminine beauty. That's kind of more subjective, but whatever. You get the point. Anyway, so we go back and then we do a little bit of telling just to clarify who these daughters are, or who these girls are. The twins' mother assured her daughter Serendipity would be full of magical wonders beyond their wildest dreams, though she refused to delve into details for fear of taking the fun out of it. As they approached the dock where Serendipity harbored, the twins couldn't help but feel deflated to discover it wasn't as enchanting as they were led to believe. So we do a little bit of clarity of why they're here and hinting at what's going to happen. But once again, this isn't important because we're going to back this up by showing exactly why it's not as enchanting and the hinting at the magical wonders. We'll see that later in the story. All right. So this part is very important. We're getting into the character interactions now. So why this is important is because rather than telling you what the characters are like, we are demonstrating it. And it's going to be much more effective in getting the point across and letting the reader come up to these decisions for yourself. So, let's just read it. Okay. Arana turned her twin with a salty expression. We've been duped. A couple kobolds were loading the ship with crates. The little red scaly dragonmen dressed in shoddy clothes and smelled like rotten fish. As they passed the girls on the gangway, one of them set down their loads to run over to the girls and marvel at their choice in fine clothes. Look, look, pretty things, so shiny, so sparkly. He pawed curiously at the ruffles of Arana's starlit dress. Soft, twinkly lights. Ew, get away from me, you little creep. Arana batted him away using the thick end of her staff, knocking the bellowing kobold into the lapping waves below the gangplank. Dissuaded from further investigations, the other kobolds picked up their burdens and quickly carried on with their business. Ugh, Wisp! Arana reached into the hood of Lance's cape and hoisted out a long, fat blue pseudo-dragon by the scruff of his neck. This ship is unacceptable. I demand you contact my mother immediately. I want to speak with her at once. Don't make such a fuss. Lanza gently pried the pseudo-dragon away from her twin's grasp, returning him to his hiding place in her cave, much to the tiny dragon's relief. We only just arrived. Let's at least look for the captain before we trouble mother and father with any complaints. Pouting, Arana folded her arms in silent rebellion, but allowed her twin to lead her aboard ship. Now, could we have just said that, instead of doing all that, could we have just said that Lanza is the more responsible, patient one, and Arana is the more stuck-up, prissy, spoiled brat kind of one? Could we have done that? Yes. Is it as interesting? No. And that's why people say that showing is better than telling. You want to show and not tell. That's what they mean. That's what the point they're trying to get across. But it's not completely true. Because telling does have its own purpose. It is specific for certain things, but it is not good for demonstrating characters because it's just not as interesting, So this is why you want to have both, because they both are good at doing what they do. And you want that balance. You want to mix. You want them to support one another and verify things that have been said. Yeah, you don't want pages of just one or the other. We'll keep going a little bit longer. Okay. They found the Captain Sanguine waiting for them above decks. So straight and to the point, just to clarify what's going on. That's the telling. Then we go into the showing to support that. What does the captain look like? Well, his patchy captain's hat depicted a cartoonish, grinning skull set upon a mass of unruly red hair that jutted out in all directions. Tall and lanky in his elven form, he had the tan skin of a sailor. He greeted the girls with a jovial expression, welcoming them aboard the ship with open arms. "Welcome, young ladies, to Serendipity. The crew of Captain Sanguine's ship of wandering wonders are at your service." Lifting his hat off his head, he bowed in a graceful demeanor, while the nearby kobolds that made up his crew hooted and jeered in a rowdy manner. Arana recoiled into Lanza, openly displaying her appallment on her face. If Sanguine noticed, he didn't seem offended in the least. "You must be Arana. You're the spitting image of your mother." "I get that a lot." Arana inclined her head proudly at the compliment. "Their mother's renowned beauty and grace was legendary, which means you're Arona. You can call me Lanza. It's less confusing that way." Arona always resented her parents for giving her a name almost exactly like her sister's. "All right then, Lanza it is." Captain Sanguine clapped his hands. "Now then, let's get you two princesses settled in. You've had a long trip. Rest assured there'll be plenty of time for sightseeing and merriment later." From an inner pocket of his trench coat, Sanguine produced 2 golden keys. One had the number 224 engraved on it, and the other had the number 225. Lanza picked the 224, leaving her sister with the 225. With a follow me gesture, Sanguine escorted them down a flight of creaky wooden stairs to their rooms on the upper of the 2 lower decks. Now, like I said, most dialogue is going to be showing, because it's something you can hear, and it's something that you can use to show what your characters are like in terms of personality. But sometimes dialogue doesn't do that, and instead it's just there to give information to the characters and both the reader, usually at the same time. So in this case, Sanguine is telling the twins about the ship and about what they can expect. So this is what I consider telling and dialogue. And it's okay to use. It's okay to use, but in small amounts. You don't want lots of pages and paragraphs of it. That's what we call info dumping, and it is not fun to read. Okay. But a little bit is okay, and sometimes necessary, as in this case. I'll give you ladies a proper tour later, but the most important thing to remember is that the upper decks are for our most esteemed guests and patrons. Those golden keys are special. They give you complete control over your room. Who can enter, who can leave, what goes in, what stays out. That's fine to do, but you need to support that later on, and I will. We might not get to it in this, but trust me, I do. I do explain what's special about the keys later on. This is just a hint of what's to come. It's a little bit of foreshadowing in the form of explaining about what, just giving the girls a little bit of heads up that they're in for something, unique. And a unique experience. What's so special about that, Arana scoffed? Isn't that how keys are supposed to work? Ah, but these are magic keys. Arana caught Lanza's gaze behind the captain's back and dramatically rolled her eyes. Lanza smirked, finding amusement in her twins' lack of enthusiasm. 210, 212, 214, as they passed through the long hall of the upper deck, Lanza couldn't help but notice how close the doors were to each other on each side of the hallway. That meant the rooms were most likely small and cramped on the inside. All right, I think that's a good stopping point. I think I've gotten enough. I think I've gotten my point across enough to where I wanted to say what I wanted to say and to demonstrate what I meant for this exercise to be like. Just to show you, to give an idea, to get you to think about how much showing you're doing, how much telling you're doing, and how to better incorporate them, how to make them more balanced, how to let them play off of each other. Hopefully this gave you some ideas for how to look at your writing, how to analyze it, how to improve it, and hopefully make you consider that, well, maybe telling isn't as bad as people say. Maybe it can be useful if I use it correctly and in small amounts. But I also need to keep in mind that showing is very, very important, and I also need to have that incorporated into my story. I needed to have it support the telling and the showing with each other, so that they're working together and one's not overpowering the other. That's the point I'm trying to get across, and hopefully it did. And if you disagree with me, that's perfectly fine. Every writer is different. We all have our own styles and preferences, and that's perfectly fine. This is what I consider to be a goal in terms of my writing. But that doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that this is the end-all way to write your stories, is by doing this balance of showing and telling. Not at all. It's all comes down to a matter of perspective, really. But yeah, so that's all I wanted to say for now. But so thanks for watching, and I hope this helped in some way. All right, bye.